The grand conclave of the high systems was not a place built for silence. Yet silence was the only thing that filled the colossal obsidian chamber, a suffocating, heavy blanket that pressed against the respiratory vents and chitinous plating of the 300 delegates gathered within. The chamber, a massive sphere of dark glass suspended in the gravitational null point of the dual star system of Orium, usually thrummed with the cacophony of 1,000 distinct languages, the shifting of heavy robes, and the hum of translation drones. But today the atmosphere was stripped of its usual bureaucratic vitality, replaced by the frigid, paralyzing grip of existential dread that transcended species barriers. High Counselor Vrax, a veteran of the Critian hegemony whose carapace bore the jagged white scars of the border wars, stood at the central podium, his clawed hands gripping the polished railing with enough force to fracture the synthetic stone, his 4 eyes narrowing as he gazed up at the holographic projection dominating the center of the hall. The image was a terrifying tapestry of destruction, a 3-dimensional rendering of the galactic northern arm where the crimson stain of the scourge was spreading like a necrotic infection, consuming star system after star system with an efficiency that defied biological logic and technological countermeasure. The scourge did not negotiate. They did not transmit demands. They simply arrived in swarms of biomechanical locusts, stripped planetary crusts for resources, and moved on, leaving dead, cold rocks in their wake, and for 6 cycles, the combined might of the high systems, the lasers of the Xylophian scholars, the plasma fire of the Critian warriors, the psionic shields of the ethereals, had failed to slow their advance by even a single light second. Vrax felt the weight of history pressing down upon his mantle, the realization that he might be the last High Counselor of a living galaxy, presiding over the funeral of civilization itself, and the heavy silence in the room was not one of respect, but of a collective holding of breath before the inevitable plunge into the dark. "The report is verified," Vrax said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the floor plates, amplified by the acoustic architecture of the sphere, though he spoke quietly, lacking his usual thunderous cadence. "The 7th Fleet has been eradicated in the Antares sector. There were no survivors. No distress beacons were recovered. The scourge has bypassed the Maginot line of the nebula and is currently burning a path toward the core worlds. We have perhaps 3 standard cycles before they reach the perimeter of this very station." A murmur of terror rippled through the assembly, a sound like dry leaves skittering over stone, as delegates exchanged horrified glances, their bioluminescent markings flashing rapidly in distress, or their tentacles coiling tight in anxiety. A delicate, crystalline being from the Silicoid Collective floated forward on a suspensor field, its body chiming softly as it resonated with fear. "High Counselor," the Silicoid chimed, the translation software rendering its tonal language into a flat, synthetic monotone that somehow made the despair sound even more absolute. "Is there no reserve? The ancient archives spoke of the precursors of the deep space vaults. Is there nothing left to throw at them? We cannot simply wait for the end." Vrax looked down at the fragile creature, feeling a pang of pity that his warrior code usually suppressed, for he knew the truth of their logistical situation better than anyone. They had thrown everything, every reserve fleet, every prototype weapon, every desperate strategy, into the maw of the enemy, and the enemy had not even blinked. "The archives are empty, delegate," Vrax replied, his voice heavy with the fatigue of 1,000 sleepless nights. "The vaults are dust. We are the apex of this galaxy, and we have been found wanting." It was in that moment of absolute resignation, when the despair had settled into the marrow of every being in the room, that the sensor grid screamed. It was not the rhythmic pulsing alarm of an incoming fleet or the sharp wail of a hull breach, but a sound that had not been heard in the conclave for 10,000 years, the gravimetric shear alert, a siren so low and powerful it rattled the teeth of the Critians and caused the liquid-based lifeforms to ripple in their containment suits. The holographic map in the center of the room flickered and distorted, the red stain of the scourge momentarily obscured by a blinding white tear that opened in the fabric of the display, originating from a sector of space that was marked on all navigational charts as the Abyssal Void, a region of dead space between the spiral arms where no star burned and no matter existed. "Report!" Vrax bellowed, his warrior instincts overriding his despair, his hand instinctively reaching for the plasma pistol at his hip even though the threat was millions of kilometers away. "Is it a scourge flank? Have they surrounded us?" The chief sensor officer, a multi-limbed creature whose eyes were fixed on a cascading waterfall of data streams, looked up, its mandibles trembling in a way that Vrax had never seen before. "No, High Counselor," the officer stammered, the fear in its voice replaced by a profound, baffled confusion. "It is not the Scourge. It is not anything we know. The shear is originating from the void. Something is exiting hyperspace, but the energy signature it is off the scale. The sensors cannot quantify the mass. It is not a fleet. It is a single object." The assembly fell into a stunned hush as the main view screen, a colossal pane of diamond glass that looked out into the starfield, darkened to compensate for a sudden, radiant flare of energy that erupted from the blackness of the void. A tear in reality that burned with the colors of a bruised nebula, violet and gold and impossible white. Out of that tear, out of the nowhere that the galaxy had ignored for eons, it came. It did not emerge quickly, like a fighter craft snapping into real space, but slowly, majestically, a leviathan rising from the depths of a dark ocean, displacing the vacuum itself with a gravitational bow wave that sent tremors through the station's stabilizers. At first, the delegates thought it was a rogue moon, for the scale of the object defied the conventional understanding of starship engineering, its silhouette blotting out the stars behind it, casting a shadow that swallowed the Scourge advance fleet which had been prowling the system's edge. It was a vessel, undeniably, but it possessed a brutalist, industrial elegance that the aesthetic-obsessed high systems had never conceived of. It was a dagger of matte gray metal, scarred and pitted by cosmic dust, lacking the smooth curves of the Zalophian ships or the ornate plating of the Critian dreadnoughts. It was a block of geometric perfection, miles upon miles of flat armor planes, bristling with antenna arrays that looked like forests of steel trees, and engines that glowed with a soft, terrifying blue light, the color of Cherenkov radiation. There were no visible windows, no bridge towers, no exposed exhaust ports, just an unbroken monolith of war, a fortress that had taught itself to fly. "The mass reading," the sensor officer whispered, the sound amplified by the stunned silence of the room. "It is. It has the gravitational footprint of a neutron star. It is pulling the local asteroids into orbit around its hull. By the ancestors, what is it?" Vrax stared at the screen, his tactical mind racing to categorize the threat, to find a weakness, to formulate a defense, but his logic centers were failing him, overwhelmed by the sheer, brute reality of the thing. It was not a ship designed for speed or comfort. It was a ship designed to survive the end of the world. As the High Conclave watched, paralyzed, the Scourge fleet, a swarm of thousands of bioships, reacted with the mindless aggression that characterized their species, detecting the new biomass and energy source and turning their hive-mind focus away from the station and toward the newcomer. The Scourge vessels, looking like cancerous clots of flesh and metal, fired their acid plasma torrents, a barrage that had melted the armor of the Critian battleships in seconds, focusing the fire of 1,000 ships onto the flank of the gray Leviathan. The delegates winced, expecting to see the metal boil, to see the great ship rupture and die just as their own fleets had died, but the beams struck the matte gray hull and simply vanished. There were no shields flaring, no energy bubbles absorbing the impact. The armor itself seemed to eat the energy, the plasma splashing harmlessly against the surface like rain against a mountain, leaving not even a scorch mark on the pristine, dark metal. The ship did not return fire. It did not alter its course. It continued its slow, inexorable drift toward the station, ignoring the Scourge as a whale ignores the krill that bump against its skin, its silence more terrifying than any weapon discharge. "Hail them," Vrax ordered, his voice tight. "If they are enemies, we are already dead. If they are not, we must know." The communications officer, a frantic Zalophian whose fingers flew across the holographic interface, shook her head. "I am trying, High Counselor. I am cycling through every frequency, every dialect, every mathematical constant. There is no response. Their communication bands are flooded with static. Wait, not static. It is music. No, it is a data stream encrypted in a way that defies our algorithms. It is dense, incredibly dense." Suddenly, the Scourge, perhaps realizing that their energy weapons were ineffective, changed tactics, their hive mind driving the smaller kamikaze drones to accelerate to relativistic speeds, intending to impact the hull of the newcomer and detonate air antimatter cores, a tactic that had cracked planetary crusts. The drones streaked forward, streaks of red fire against the black, but as they approached within a certain radius of the gray ship, a distance that seemed to be measured with mathematical precision, they simply ceased to exist. There was no explosion, no flash of light. One moment they were there, screaming through the void, and the next they were gone, erased from the universe as if deleted by a cosmic editor. The sensor officer gasped, clutching his head as his neural implants overloaded. "They didn't shoot them," he cried out, his voice bordering on hysteria. "They manipulated the local space-time manifold. They folded the space the drones were occupying into a pocket dimension and collapsed it. They are weaponizing physics. Who has that kind of power? The energy requirements would drain a star." Vrax felt a chill that had nothing to do with the station's environmental controls. He was looking at a civilization that treated the laws of physics not as immutable rules, but as suggestions to be ignored when convenient. The gray ship was now filling the entire viewscreen, its prow looming over the station like the judgment of a god. And for the first time, Vrax noticed the markings on the hull. They were not the elegant script of the high systems, nor the chaotic scratches of the Scourge. They were blocky, angular symbols, painted in a faded white that contrasted with the dark gray hull. He could not read them, but the optical translation matrix, which had access to the oldest, most fragmented databases of the precursor era, spun its wheels, searching for a match. TCS Dauntless. The translation appeared on the bottom of the screen, followed by a subdesignation that the computer struggled to interpret, finally settling on a rough approximation. Terra Conglomerate Ship. Class, World Breaker. Registry, Lost. The room stared at the words. Terra. The word tasted strange in Vrax's mouth. It was a phoneme that appeared in the oldest myths, a cautionary tale of a species that had burned itself out before it ever reached the stars, a primitive race of violent primates on a death world in the Orion Spur. But this engine of godlike power could not be the work of those dust-bound savages. The ship came to a halt, perfectly matching the station's rotation with a grace that belied its massive tonnage, and for a long, agonizing minute, nothing happened. Then the speakers in the Grand Conclave crackled. It was not the smooth, synthesized voice of a diplomat, nor the screech of a conqueror. It was a voice that sounded tired, human, and distinctly unimpressed. "This is Captain Valerius of the United Terran Stewardship Vessel Dauntless," the voice said, speaking a dialect of Galactic standard that was archaic, centuries out of date, yet perfectly understandable. "We picked up a lot of noise in this sector. You folks seem to have a pest control problem. Requesting permission to dock and discuss the parameters of assistance. And please tell the little red ships to stop scratching my paint, or I'll have to turn on the automated point defense, and I'd really rather not clean up the mess." The shock in the room was absolute. Vrax looked at Speaker Alara of the Xylofian Conclave, the most brilliant diplomat in the sector, and saw her mandibles hanging open in undignified stupor. "Pest control?" Alara whispered, the absurdity of the phrase clashing with the apocalyptic reality of the Scourge. "They call the Scourge pests." Vrax straightened his spine, smoothing his mantle. He was a warrior, and he recognized the tone of the voice on the radio. It was the tone of a soldier who had seen so much war that the threat of death had lost its sting, replaced by a weary competence. "Permission granted, Dauntless," Vrax replied, forcing his voice to remain steady. "We are transmitting docking coordinates. Be advised the station's structural integrity is compromised. We cannot support the mass of your vessel." A low, dry chuckle came over the speakers. "Don't worry about that, Counselor. We're holding our own gravity. We'll just park alongside." Sending a shuttle over. Valerius out. The link severed with a sharp click, leaving the conclave in a silence that was even more profound than before. The Scourge, seemingly sensing a predator that outclassed them, had pulled back to the edge of the system, hovering in a confused formation, their hive mind calculating probabilities and finding only zero-sum outcomes. The humans, if that is what they were, had achieved in 5 minutes what the high systems had failed to do in 6 cycles. They had made the Scourge afraid. The shuttle that detached from the flank of the Dauntless was a stark contrast to the mothership. While the mothership was a brutalist slab of armor, the shuttle was a sleek, aggressive delta-wing craft, painted in white and gold, moving with a predator's grace. It docked at the VIP airlock, and Vrax, a compan, wide by Alara and a squad of elite Critian honor guards, waited to receive the visitors. The airlock cycled, the hiss of decontamination gases filling the corridor, and as the heavy blast doors slid open, Vrax prepared himself for anything: cybernetic monstrosities, glowing energy beings, hulking super soldiers. What walked out was disappointing. The figure leading the group was a bipedal mammal of average height, lacking natural armor, claws, or visible weapons. He wore a uniform of dark blue fabric with gold piping, a simple peaked cap resting on hair that was graying at the temples. His face was lined with age, his skin pale, his eyes a dull, unthreatening brown. He looked soft, vulnerable. Behind him were 4 soldiers in full environmental armor that looked far more impressive, bulky and angular with visors that glowed with tactical data. But the leader, this Valerius, was unarmored. He walked with a relaxed gait, his hands clasped behind his back, looking around the docking bay with mild curiosity, as if he were visiting a museum rather than a war zone. He stopped in front of Vrax, looked up at the towering alien warrior and smiled, a small, polite expression that didn't quite reach his tired eyes. "High Counselor Vrax, I presume," Valerius said, extending a hand in the universal gesture of greeting that the high systems had abandoned centuries ago as unsanitary. "Captain Elias Valerius, apologies for the dramatic entrance. The slipspace drive tends to make a bit of a splash when we come out of the deep freeze." Vrax looked at the small, soft hand, then at the massive armored guards, then back to the captain. He gingerly extended his own claw, enveloping the human's hand, careful not to crush the fragile bones. To his surprise, the human's grip was firm, surprisingly strong, and his skin was warm. "You are Terran?" Vrax asked, the skepticism bleeding into his voice. "From Earth," Valerius nodded, retrieving his hand. "Originally, that was a long time ago. We've been away, walking the perimeter, you might say." Alara stepped forward, her curiosity overcoming her fear. "Away, where?" "The archives say your species never left your home system. You destroyed yourselves in nuclear fire." Valerius let out a short, sharp laugh. "Is that what the history books say? Well, it's a good cover story, keeps the tourists away. We didn't destroy ourselves, Madam Speaker. We just realized that the neighborhood was getting crowded and we wanted a quiet place to work. So we left. We went into the void, the space between the galaxies, to build, to think, to grow up." "The void?" Alara's eyes widened. "But there is nothing there, no energy, no matter. It is the abyss." Valerius's expression hardened slightly, the tiredness in his eyes replaced by a glimpse of something ancient and terrifyingly enduring. "There's plenty there if you know how to look, and if you know how to survive the cold. We learned. We adapted. We built ships like the Dauntless because out there are things worse than your scourge, things that eat stars for snacks. We had to become durable." He gestured vaguely back toward his ship. "But we monitor the old frequencies. We heard the noise, saw the scourge eating the garden. We decided it was time to come back and do a little weeding. We don't like it when someone messes up the lawn." The casual metaphor sent a shiver down Vrax's spine. To this human, the galaxy, the sum of all their civilizations, their histories, their tragedies, was a garden, and the scourge, the ultimate threat, were merely weeds. It was an arrogance so profound it circled back around to humility. He spoke not as a conqueror, but as a caretaker, a janitor with a flamethrower. "We need to discuss strategy," Vrax said, trying to regain control of the situation. "The scourge adapts. They will analyze your ship. They will find a way to breach your armor. We must coordinate our fleets." Valerius shook his head gently. "With all due respect, Counselor, putting your fleets in the line of fire would just get good people killed. My boys and girls have been itching for a fight for 3 centuries. The Dauntless isn't just a ship, she's a siege engine. We don't need a strategy. We need a target list." He tapped a small device on his wrist, and a holographic projection sprang up between them, showing the Scourge fleet. "These biologicals, they communicate via subspace telepathy, right? A hive mind." Alara nodded. "Yes, it is their greatest strength. They move as one. They cannot be rooted because they feel no individual fear." Valerius nodded, looking unimpressed. "Right, so if we scream loud enough on their frequency, we can pop their heads. Electronic warfare. Something we got very good at while fighting the Void Wraiths. We're going to deploy a dissonance cascade. It might get a little loud on the psychic bands. Tell your telepaths to take a nap." The meeting in the tactical room was unlike any Vrax had ever attended. There was no debating, no voting, no political posturing. Valerius simply stood at the table, inputted data from the station's sensors into his own device, and laid out a plan that was terrifying in its simplicity. The humans were not going to outmaneuver the Scourge. They were going to walk straight through them. As they spoke, Vrax began to realize the true nature of the humans. They were not warriors in the Critian sense, seeking glory and honor. They were not scholars like the Xylophon, seeking knowledge. They were problem solvers, brutally efficient, terrifyingly pragmatic problem solvers. They viewed war not as an art, but as a failure of engineering, a mess to be cleaned up with the most efficient tool available. And the Dauntless was a very efficient tool. "Captain," Vrax asked during a lull in the planning, "you speak of fighting the Void Wraiths and surviving the cold. How long has your species been out there? The records say you vanished 4,000 years ago." Valerius paused, looking at the holographic map, a shadow crossing his face. "Time flows differently in the void, Counselor. Relativistic effects, gravity wells, dimensional drift. For you, it's been 4,000 years. For us, it's been longer, much longer. We've seen empires rise and fall while we were drifting in the dark. We've forgotten more about war than this galaxy has ever learned. That's why we left. We were too good at it. We were afraid of what we would do to you if we stayed." The revelation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The humans hadn't fled because they were weak. They had fled because they were dangerous. They had exiled themselves to protect the galaxy from them, and now they were back, the leash taken off because the galaxy faced a threat that required a monster to defeat it. "Act 2, Valerius murmured, checking his chrono. "The Scourge is regrouping. They're going to try a mass rush, millions of bioforms. They think they can overwhelm the point defense systems by sheer weight of numbers." He tapped his comms bead. "Tactical, this is Valerius. Unlock the singularity projectors. Pattern Delta. Keep it clean." He looked at Vrax. "You might want to watch this. It's educational." The view screen showed the Scourge fleet moving. It was a tide of flesh and metal, a wall of enemies so dense it blocked out the starlight. Millions of ships, from frigate-sized biodrones to moon-sized hive ships, charged toward the Dauntless and the station. It was a wave of death that should have been unstoppable. On the Dauntless, ports opened along the massive hull. They did not fire beams of light. Instead, they launched small, black spheres, no larger than a cargo container. These spheres shot out into the center of the approaching swarm and stopped. For a second, nothing happened. Then the spheres activated. They were not bombs. They were gravity anchors, artificial event horizons. Instantly, the space in the center of the Scourge fleet folded in on itself. The enemy ships were not blown apart. They were dragged together, crushing into one another, their hulls buckling, their biological components liquefying under the sudden, intense gravitational shear. The swarm swirled like water down a drain, thousands of ships screaming silently as they were pulled into the miniature black holes the humans had created. It was a massacre. It was physics weaponized on an industrial scale. The Dauntless fired its main batteries then, beams of coherent gravity that punched through the hive ships, twisting them into scrap metal, snapping their spines, turning the pride of the Scourge into drifting debris fields. Inside the conclave, the silence was absolute. This was not a battle. It was an extermination. The humans were not fighting, they were deleting the enemy. Vrax felt a primal fear, a deep biological urge to run, to hide from these creatures who played with the fundamental forces of the universe as if they were toys. "By the Maker," Alara whispered. "They are gods." Valerius heard her and shook his head, his face somber. "No, Madam Speaker, we aren't gods. Gods create, we just destroy. We're the janitors, and right now we're taking out the trash." The battle, if it could be called that, lasted less than an hour. The Scourge, an enemy that had terrorized the galaxy for years, was reduced to a cloud of expanding gas and debris. The Dauntless sat amidst the ruin, untouched, its blue engines pulsing slowly, a silent sentinel in the graveyard it had created. Valerius turned to the stunned council. "Threat neutralized. Now we have a lot of work to do. That biomass is going to rot and cause a plague if we don't incinerate it properly. And we need to talk about your perimeter defenses. They're lacking." But the story did not end with the victory. As the adrenaline faded and the reality of the human return settled in, the diplomatic friction began. The high systems were grateful, yes, but they were also terrified. How do you negotiate with a species T? Hat can summon black holes. How do you enforce trade laws on a people who live in the void? The days following the battle were filled with tense meetings. The humans were polite, calm, and maddeningly aloof. They refused offers of territory. "We prefer the void," they said. They refused trade for their weapons. "You'll shoot your eye out," Valerius had joked, though nobody laughed. They simply wanted access to the galactic databases, historical records, and star charts. They were searching for something. Vrax, his warrior instincts telling him there was more to this than a rescue mission, requested a private audience with Valerius aboard the Dauntless. The interior of the human ship was a shock. Vrax had expected a grim, militaristic barracks, cold steel and harsh lights. Instead, the corridors of the Dauntless were lined with hydroponic gardens. Vines crawled along the bulkheads, the air smelled of wet earth and blooming jasmine. The lighting was warm, simulating a yellow sun. Children ran through the halls, human children laughing, playing games, ignoring the massive warborgs that stood guard at the intersections. It was a city, a traveling world. Vrax realized then that the Dauntless wasn't just a warship, it was an ark, a home. Valerius met him in a garden atrium, sitting on a wooden bench, feeding crumbs to a flock of synthetic birds. "It surprises you," Valerius said, not looking up. "The greenery, you expected a dungeon." Vrax nodded, sitting slowly, his massive frame creaking the bench. "I expected a weapon, Captain, but this is a world." "We carry our home with us," Valerius said softly. The void is cold, Vrax. It eats at your soul. If we didn't have this, the green, the life, the reminder of where we came from, we would have become the monsters you feared. This ship keeps us human. Vrax looked at the human, seeing the weariness etched deep into his face. Why did you really come back, Ilias? Vrax asked, using the human's given name for the first time. You defeated the Scourge with ease. You could conquer this galaxy in a week. Yet you ask for nothing but data. You are looking for something. What is it? Valerius stopped feeding the birds. He dusted the crumbs from his hands and looked at Vrax, his eyes dark and bottomless. We aren't looking for something, Vrax. We're checking the clock. The clock. The Scourge, Valerius began, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. They didn't just appear, they were running. You saw them. They were a swarm, consuming resources, moving fast. They weren't conquering, they were fleeing. Vrax felt a cold pit open in his stomach. Fleeing from what? Valerius stood up and walked to the viewport, looking out at the stars of the high systems. The reason we went into the void, Vrax, wasn't just to grow up. It was to see what was coming. We built observatories in the dark where there was no light pollution. We looked further than anyone else, and we saw it. The Scourge is the first ripple, the shockwave. Speak plainly, human, Vrax demanded, rising to his feet. Entropy, Valerius said. Accelerated, weaponized entropy. There is something approaching our universe, or rather our universe is colliding with something else, a region of anti-reality. The Scourge's home galaxy was consumed first. They ran here to survive, but the decay is following them. The void, the place we call home, it's shrinking. The edges of the map are burning. He turned back to Vrax. We came back because this galaxy, the Milky Way, is the keystone. It's the structural pivot point of this local cluster. If we can fortify it, if we can use the mass of the galactic core to anchor the reality field, we might be able to weather the storm. But we can't do it alone. We have the tech, we have the ships, but we don't have the manpower. We need you. We need the Critian fleets to hold the line while we build the engines. We need the Xylophian scientists to calculate the stress vectors. We need the high systems to stop playing politics and start building a dam against the end of time. Vrax stared at the human. The scale of it was impossible to comprehend. The war against the Scourge, the fear of the Dauntless, it was all petty, small, meaningless. The humans hadn't come to save them from a fleet, they had come to save them from the dark. You are talking about saving the universe? Vrax asked, his voice trembling. Saving this universe, Valerius corrected. There are others, but this one is ours, and I'm quite fond of it. It has good coffee. The human smiled, a genuine, sad smile. So, High Counselor, are you ready for the real war? Because the Scourge was just the warm-up. The revelation broke Vrax and then rebuilt him. He understood now the calm of the humans, their lack of arrogance. They were terrified too, but they had moved past panic into purpose. They were the adults in the room, trying to organize the children before the house caught fire. Vrax extended his hand. The Critian hegemony stands with you, Captain. We will hold the line. The following months were a blur of activity that transformed the galaxy. The Dauntless was no longer a mysterious stranger. It was the command center of a galactic effort. The distrust evaporated, replaced by the desperate urgency of survival. The humans shared their technology, not weapons, but construction tech, energy generation, shield harmonics. The Xylophian scientists wept when they saw the human equations, realizing that the humans had solved problems the Conclave had been stuck on for millennia. The Critian shipyards began churning out hulls reinforced with human alloys. The galaxy united, not out of idealism, but out of necessity. And through it all, the Dauntless hovered near the galactic core, its massive engines modifying the spin of the supermassive black hole, turning the heart of the galaxy into a generator of unimaginable power. Then came the signal. It wasn't a sound. It was a vibration felt in the bones of every living thing in the galaxy. The stars at the rim of the galaxy began to flicker. The darkness was arriving. The something Valerius had spoken of. It was a wall of nothingness, erasing stars, deleting matter. The Scourge had run from it, but there was nowhere left to run. The Alliance fleet, a mix of grand alien dreadnoughts and sleek human destroyers, gathered at the perimeter. Vrax stood on the bridge of his new flagship, the Undying, outfitted with human gravity cannons. He looked at the comms screen where Valerius stood on the bridge of the Dauntless. "It is here," Vrax said. "The Great Filter." "It's just a wave, Vrax," Valerius said, his voice calm, steadying the nerves of billions watching the broadcast. "And we are the breakwater. All ships link your shield harmonics to the Dauntless. We are going to channel the energy of the core. We are going to push back." The wall of darkness hit the fleet. It was a tsunami of silence. Shields flared, buckling under the pressure of non-existence. Ships exploded not from fire but from stress, their hulls shattered by the conflict of reality and anti-reality. But the line held. The Dauntless, glowing with the power of the galactic core, fired a beam of pure white light, not a laser but a stream of reordered reality, a statement of existence shouted into the void. I am. The beam struck the darkness, and the darkness recoiled. For hours the battle raged. It was a metaphysical struggle, a contest of wills. The humans with their iron discipline held the network together. The aliens with their desperate ferocity poured every ounce of energy they had into the grid. Vrax felt his ship groaning, the metals screaming, his crew fainting from the psychic pressure. We cannot hold, a tactical officer screamed. The entropy levels are rising. Vrax slammed his fist on the console. We hold, look at the humans. They do not waver, and they didn't. On the screen, the Dauntless was burning, its armor slagging off, its engines overloading, but it did not move. It stood like a rock in the river. And then the break, the wall of darkness fractured. The beam from the Dauntless pierced through, illuminating the void beyond. And in that brief flash, Vrax saw it. He saw what the humans had seen. Beyond the darkness, there was not emptiness. There was structure, a lattice of light, other galaxies, a web of existence. The darkness was not an end, it was a shell, a barrier, and they had cracked it. The pressure vanished. The darkness dissipated, rolling back like fog in the morning sun. The stars returned. The silence of the void was replaced by the cheers of a trillion beings. The Dauntless drifted, scarred, smoking, darker than before, but alive. Valerius's voice came over the comms, weak but triumphant. Target, suppressed, reality integrity, 98%. Good work, everyone, drinks are on me. Vrax slumped in his command chair, his heart's pounding. They had won. They had fought the end of the universe and won. In the aftermath, the galaxy was changed forever. The humans did not rule, they guided. They established the stewardship, a council dedicated to the maintenance of the galaxy. The Dauntless was repaired, its scars left as badges of honor. But the biggest change was in the spirit of the high systems. They were no longer afraid of the dark. They knew what was out there. They knew that the universe was hostile, cold, and indifferent. But they also knew that they were not alone. They had the humans. The crazy, stubborn, terrifying humans who looked at the end of the world and said, no. Years later, Vrax, now retired and old, visited the Dauntless one last time. He found Valerius in the garden, older too, watching children play. We did it, Elias, Vrax said. We saved the garden. Valerius nodded, smiling. For now, Vrax, for now, but weeds always grow back, and fences need mending. He looked up at the stars, his eyes reflecting the infinite. But that's what we do, we're the gardeners, and the harvest is looking good. The camera pulls back, leaving the two old warriors in the garden of the starship, pulling back through the hull of the Dauntless, past the scarred armor, past the fleet of the Alliance, pulling back until the galaxy is a spinning spiral of light in the darkness, a jewel protected by the silent, gray sentinels who came from nowhere to save everything. The twist was not that the humans were conquerors or gods or demons. Twist was that they were the only ones who cared enough to stay awake while the rest of the universe slept. They were the ultimate warship, yes, but their war was not against life, it was for it. And in the silence of the eternal void, that made all the difference. The human story was not one of dominion, but of endurance. They were the anvil that broke the hammer. And as the screen fades to black, a single transmission lingers in the static. Station keeping maintained. The watch continues. End of log.